Raise your hand if you do natural light portraits. It's probably the easiest type of photography to do. Most of us start with natural light portraits, but we make some mistakes. So I made a little list here on the mistakes that I see when you post pictures. I've never done any of these. Okay, let's start with the first one. The first mistake natural light photographers make is not assessing or even seeing the light. I think when we all first start out, we see our subject more than we see light. I think that's how we all start. So a lot of my early portraits, sometimes there wasn't any light. Sometimes the light was coming from behind, from the side. I noticed that there was no pattern. So I wasn't really even seeing the light. So that's the first mistake. That's like rock bottom foundation. You're the worst. Not seeing the light. Number 2, direction of light. Now this one goes with the first one. After a while, you start to see the light, but you're not using the best light in the environment. And we talked about this. I did a video called Good Light, Bad Light. If you want to watch that, I'll link it up below. But we talked about how you can use your hands and move them around and kind of see where your hands light up. Like for example, if you notice here, my hands are kind of in shadow. So a lot of my beginning photos I took with the good light actually being behind my subject or, a little bit to the side that way. And if I were to just move my hands around, you could see your hands like light up really nice. And so that's where the good light is coming from. Use your hands. I've already lost track of what number I'm up to, so I'm just going to keep the list going. I think this is number 3, but one problem I see a lot of new photographers do, and I did, is that when we photograph people, most of the natural light, whether it be an overcast day or you're in the shade, comes from above. And what happens is we end up getting sort of raccoon eyes because our brows leave shadows underneath. And so you kind of get raccoon eyes. And at first I was shooting portraits that way. I could see old pictures of my kids that all I'd have to do is either get their chin up a little bit. If I had them look up, I noticed that my pictures were better if the kids were like looking up at me. These were all, when you start out, these are all accidents. When you're like, hey, that picture's good. So you just need to understand why some of the pictures are good. And a lot of times it has to do with that the light is hitting the subject broadly on the face as opposed to leaving those shadows. Now, another problem, which is a little bit more rare, but sometimes if the light bounces off a very reflective surface, like a sidewalk, it will actually give Halloween lighting. And you'll notice that if you see a catch light that's a little low in the eyes. And this also is a problem when you first start out and someone tells you to use a reflector. And if you use a reflector, a lot of times people start by putting the reflector underneath. If the sun hits that reflector, you're going to get more Halloween lighting. And it's kind of hard to see when you're first starting out, but as you get better, you'll notice you'll be able to use a reflector a little bit better to bounce light back in to fill in those shadows. The next one is over-relying on shade, open shade. A lot of times I've seen photographers, like if I'm in a park or something and I see them shooting an engagement session or something, I could see the beautiful light over here. There's just either a shaft of light or there's a little bit brighter area. And they're kind of more concerned about being under a bridge or where there's too much shade. And sometimes we overuse the shade because we're afraid of the sun. So there's 2 things here. Number 1, if you are going to shoot in open shade, which I do all the time, I highly recommend using the border between where the sun is hitting and where the shade is. That's gonna kind of be your best light right there because you're getting that really nice soft light where the shade starts. The more you move into the tunnel or the building or further away from that light, the quality is not gonna be as good. And you're gonna kind of get dead eyes sometimes. Dead eyes is where you're not using the best direction of light, you're not using the best quality of light. And this happens with a lot of times dead eyes. That means there's no catch light in the eyes when you're deep in the buildings, you're deep in the alley, and there's no light bouncing off anything, okay? So be aware of dead eyes. Be aware of just being too much in the shade. Which brings me to my next point. Something that I learned recently is to embrace the sunlight. I was so afraid as a natural light photographer of the sun that I was always looking for shade and going deep into the shade. Now, by the way, when I started out, I did use the sun, and another big mistake on the list is you don't, again, know what the light is doing. So you will shadows get cast on other people if the direction is wrong and the quality is wrong. So a lot of times using the open sun incorrectly gives you horrible shadows. So that's why you're afraid of the sun, because you look at your pictures, you're like, oh man. Now, what I always used to do in the beginning is turn their back to the sun and try to reflect some light back. That is a tried and true technique. But what I've started doing recently was actually just using the sun. Like, who cares? In fashion photography and in a lot of editorial photography, they use the sun right in the middle of the street. As long as you have the person's face not casting extreme shadows, then you should be okay. Not being afraid of the sun. Gah! The next one is color casts. I think a lot of natural light photographers don't really take into consideration that they're photographing on red brick, or that the person's wearing an orange shirt, or that the building they're next to that they're putting them on is all brick. That's really going to affect your skin tones. Oh, the other one is a super bright sunny day and grass. The green hue of grass lighting up the person underneath. So if you are going to shoot in those nightmare situations, you really should have a reflector that blocks that dirty light, that colored light, away from people's skin. Because if you do shoot in those environments, you're going to be a little frustrated. You're going to blame your camera. You're not going to understand what's going on when you edit. Why does the skin look weird? And there are times where I've had to shoot in those environments, and I've actually created brushes in Lightroom where one of them is remove grass hue, and you just brush off some of the green by adding a little bit of red. But so it happens. Sometimes the grass just bounces up into people's skin. Try to use a reflector, or if you have time, you are a natural light photographer, but we're going to talk about using artificial lights when you have to in a second. Actually, let's do it now. The last thing that kind of happens when you're a national photographer. Thank you, America. The other thing that happens when you're a natural light photographer is when there's no light. And this one has happened to me in the past. There was one time where I forgot that it was daylight savings time, and I had scheduled a shoot. And here, if you're not from America, we change our clock like twice a year. And all of a sudden, the sun was setting around 4 p.m., and that's when the shoot started. And as a natural light photographer, all is good unless all of a sudden there's no light. And so I think if you're deep in shadow or you're in that tunnel and you're restricted, that's where you, as a natural light photographer, need to say, you know what, I'm a natural light photographer, but I have lights and I can use lights. And you'll notice that your work will move to the next level if you start using light sometimes when there's no light. When you're shooting in the middle of the day and you're using open shade that's kind of green because of the grass, well, you know what? Adding a light will decontaminate that scene. And it'll get rid of the red brick. And you'll have more consistency because you know what color your lights are. I think that there's a point where you're a natural light photographer, but you can't always rely on natural light. Sometimes you do need to have like a backup flash or something with a modifier and learn how to use that. I think when there's no light, you're really going to get great results because you know what you're doing. You are not at the mercy of the natural light. All right, I hope that helped you guys, and happy shooting.